Hey everyone, this is Brown at IF Brown. Hope y'all are doing well on this lovely afternoon that we're having. And today we are going back into the world of Warhammer Fantasy with Skaven Wars, The Black Plague by C.L. Warner. This particular omnibus was put out in 2019, and it was a part of the Warhammer Chronicles line, which was in turn a series of omnibuses that collected and reprinted several classic stories or trilogies that were a part of the Warhammer Fantasy setting. And in my opinion, these omnibuses made it that much easier for the casual reader to, say, dip their toes into this particular world. And I would describe the Warhammer Fantasy setting as a mixture of Lord of the Rings meets Game of Thrones. And you have, the magic, you got the fantastical elements, you have, the wondrous creatures, you have the terrifying creatures, but you also have a lot of the cynicism and backstabbing and just unhappy endings that come with, Game of Thrones. And so while it's a wonderful and oftentimes enthralling experience for us readers to look through one of these stories, if you're a resident of this world, it's not a happy place to be, and you have a very difficult life ahead of you. And this world is full of dangers. I mean, you have orcs, you have dark elves, you have demons, you have just plain old human nature, in the corrupted in the worst way possible. And even if it's not demonically corrupted, I mean, you have basic things like greed and hunger for power and things like that, being taken up to 11. And so when good triumphs, it's all too rare, unfortunately. But one of the worst threats of this particular setting was a race of monsters called the Skaven. And as I showed you with the book cover, the Skaven are a race of humanoid rat creatures who, their way of the way they came to be is oftentimes up for debate, but that's a story for another time. But nonetheless, they've nearly conquered the entirety of the Warhammer Fantasy setting, and oftentimes, civilizations did not even know it because those in power chose to keep that little information from them, because the theory was that if civilizations and the subjects knew that they came that close to being wiped out by monsters that live underneath their very feet, then there'd be sort of a anarchy on a scale unheard of that a puny human army or just any army in general wouldn't be able to do much in the way of putting down. And so the stories that are collected in here do a very good job of conveying just how terrifying and evil the Skaven themselves were, but also just how depraved and I guess twisted those in power within the realm of humanity could be as well. So you have two forms of evil kind of going face to face, and it's a very compelling read, because you're obviously, if you've got any common sense, you are wanting good to prevail, but at the same time, it's like watching, say, a classic gangster movie, like, say, Scarface or Heat or something like that, in which you're a cop and the story of a protagonist who happens to be a criminal, and yes, that you're along for the ride with someone who is within the realm of evil, but because you're with this particular character, you're wanting to see what happens next, if that makes sense. And this is how I would describe the Black Plague trilogy. And I will say, though, that there are good characters. I mean, I should say there are morally good characters within this setting, and you are rooting for them to succeed against the forces of evil. But this being the Warhammer setting, then going in that there's not going to be much in the way of a happy ending for the most part, unless, say, it's been earned, or you say certain characters who were there at the beginning managed to survive all the way to the end of the trilogy and only then is there something resembling a happy ending. But even then, they've been scarred, irreparably by the nightmares that they've had to endure, through, warfare and psychological horror. And the novels that are collected in here are, let's see, Dead Winter, Blighted Empire, and Wolf of Sigmar. And those 3 novels officially make up the Black Plague trilogy, but there are also a couple of short stories or novellas that are collected as well. There was Plague Priest, Plague Doctor, A Question of Faith, and The Last Man. And so while the novels, the trilogy of novels, do a good job of maintaining a constant storyline, albeit with a cast of revolving characters, the standalone short stories do a good job of providing the reader with, say, an isolated look or a more individualized look as to the horror that was so prevalent within this time period in the Warhammer Fantasy setting. And C.L. Warner does a very good job of staying consistent from book to book and short story to short story, because sometimes what might happen is there'll be an ongoing story within, say, a novel series, but then there'll be some short stories that, while they might actually be good stories, they don't necessarily line up with what's been going on in the stories proper. But he actually does a really good job of making sure that the short stories line up with what's going on in the novels, because in the novels, in the trilogy, there's basically a couple of decades at least pass, and you see characters go from being, say, almost teenagers to full-grown adults, if they live that long, that is. And I thought it was really impressive because you saw some characters actually have an arc, and granted, some of them lived longer than others, but still, the fact that there was progression and character development, both for the good characters and the bad characters, morally speaking, I mean. And that's something that I will say, is that there were a ton of characters within these novels, and the protagonists, or the main characters, were all well written, but I think, in my opinion at least, there's so many of them that at times it can be hard to keep track of who's who. And that's where I wish that this particular omnibus had, say, a cast of characters guide. Case in point, in the Warhammer 40K series of books, there's almost 99.9% of the time a cast of characters at the beginning that's listed at the beginning of the book, so that way, the reader can check up on who's who. And I really think that something like that would have helped with this omnibus, considering that you're going through 3 novels worth plus several short stories. And that being said, once you nail down who's who, it does make it easier to keep track of what's going on, just in terms of from a character standpoint. But just bear in mind, it might take a bit of getting used to in that regard. But one of the things that I think was very intriguing about the Skaven and how they were portrayed is that sometimes you'll be reading, say, okay, I remember it was a long time ago, I read a couple of novels that were a part of the Warcraft series, and there was at least one that I read, I think it was called Lore of the Clans, and it was about the orc that came to power and became one of their leaders. And he was kind of, I guess you could say, he was the protagonist of the book, and from the human's perspective, I guess more anti-hero in a sense, but at the same time, he was a part of a race of creatures that were at odds with humanity. But nonetheless, when you read that particular book, you kind of understood more about the orcs and their culture, and you also understood more about their motivations. And so even when there was confrontation, you saw the orcs as more than, say, roaring savages. I mean, you saw them as, yes, they were bestial, they were savage in combat, but they had, honor and things like that. And so in a lot of ways, on the outside looking in, there were some very admirable and relatable qualities, once you get past, the fearsomeness. But in this case, with the Skaven, there is nothing honorable about these guys. There's nothing sympathetic. They are straight up pure evil. And while granted, there is a reason as to why they are the way they are, and it's arguably outside of their control, the point is, even that if that's the case, or I should say, even that being the case, there's no saving them. There's no form of redemption, and there's nothing that you can root for with them. It's just, straight up evil, and it's a horrifying circumstance to be in if you're confronted with a pack of them, or horde, a whole army of them. And because 9 times out of 10, they will outnumber you easily. And I will say, though, that it was intriguing because even though, the Skaven were straight up evil, and, there's no way, anyone in their right mind would want to root for these guys. It was interesting, though, because there were rivalries that were depicted amongst them. Certain warlords or plague lords or plague priests or plague monks, I think is what they were called. But you have all these rivalries because in their own way, they all served this dark god called the Horned Rat. And there's a lot of debate as to, whether the Horned Rat is its own deity, or if it is merely, say, the chaos god Nurgle, albeit in another form. And so I thought that was, I always thought that was an interesting argument. But anyway, though, all the factions of the Skaven, in their own way, are trying to worship the Horned Rat, but they're still having all these rivalries with one another. And the only way to ensure any form of loyalty is through terror and force. And they even treat their own subjects like sub-level slaves. We're talking worse than humanity has treated slaves, in my opinion. And I know this is just a fantasy setting, but yeah, it's that bad. So it's interesting in that respect, in terms of, say, evil versus evil, but at the same time, you're not pulling for these guys to win, because regardless of if any of them win, regardless of who comes out on top with the Skaven, they're going to lead the entire race into wiping out the entirety of civilization in the Warhammer fantasy setting. And while a lot of the ruling powers of humanity, or I should say the Empire or Bretonia, may be corrupt, there are also a lot of innocent people, a lot of good people who are caught up in all that. So it's one of those cases where, yes, it would be a case of evil versus evil, in the sense that you got the whole race of monsters who are straight up evil, say, going up against the forces of the ruling bodies of humanity, who tend to be evil more often than not, but they're pulling the strings, and the people that they're using, may not be evil. They may be, just trying to get through the day. They might just be trying to survive in this setting, and yet here they are being pawns in a game that they didn't even want to play. And so when you get into the mindset of the characters caught in the middle of all this, that's when the horror really comes into play, because some live, some die. I should say a few live, many die. But nonetheless, regardless of who lives and who dies, the horror stays with you. And one of the things that I liked about it was that one of the characters that I didn't think, I knew he was an important character, but I didn't think he was going to be important enough to say last all the way to the end of the book. But his name was Mandrid, and he actually is next in line to be ruler of his kingdom, but he's one of the few indisputably good characters within this series of novels. And you see him going from an older teenager all the way to an adult. And it's fascinating watching his progression from someone who's naive and arrogant in some ways, but I mean not a bad kid or not a bad person. It's just he's lacking in life experience. And in some ways, I mean, his father was trying to protect him from, say, like the darker side of things. But once he starts finding out what's going on, and he's put in a position where he has to lead, and that's where you actually see him go from I guess you could say a cold and calculating leader in some respects, but nonetheless he never loses compassion for his fellow subjects, be they nobles or commoner. And so he's one of the few indisputably morally good characters within the series of novels, and he's definitely someone I was pulling for every step of the way. And so there were a few other characters that managed to stand out in the sense that in one case there was a knight by the name of Eric, and he was an interesting character because he meets a lot of the I guess you could say expectations of what passes for a noble knight in other fantasy novels, but him being in this setting of Warhammer Fantasy, he gets screwed over quite a bit, and things don't go well for him. But at the same time, he just, even when you lose touch with him, in say the majority of one of the books, once he comes back, you see that, I mean, regardless of, how things turned out, he's still in the fight. He's still trying. And I mean, as damning as the experience has been, this whole war, going up against, the unending threat of the Skaven, as well as some of the those in power who, would stab him and his company in the back. I mean, the guy, he keeps trying, he keeps fighting, and he keeps, striving to do what he can in this war against the darkness. And so he's definitely also a character that you find yourself rooting for. And so and also there was even a one of the I'm not going to say he was like a main character, but he was definitely one of the top supporting characters. His name was Kargaz, and he was a dwarf. And he and Eric actually end up becoming friends, I believe. I think it's with Eric. But anyway, though, the dwarf, though, with him, you definitely get an insight into the culture of dwarfish, is it dwarven or dwarfish society? And you see just how much importance they place on, say, debts, whether it be, say, a debt of aggression or a debt of gratitude. I mean, these guys take that stuff seriously, and they also happen to be one of the few races that are utterly immune to the Black Plague, which comes into play on more than one occasion. And I really liked Kargaz's character because, for the most part, I mean, you see him amongst the human characters. And so, for the most part, the human characters are the focus of the series, as well as the Skaven characters. But whenever Kargaz gets a moment where, you look into his mindset, I mean, you catch a lot of, reminiscing and flashbacks to, say, his experiences in life, and you also appreciate how far back the dwarven history goes, as well as why the dwarves and the Skaven hate each other so much. And so I really liked his character. It was fascinating because you have this one character who essentially takes the concept of honor up to 11. Whereas a lot of the human characters, I mean, some of them, I'm not going to say who, some of the human characters actually start off as good, but then throughout, the passing of time, various things happen, and they end up, sadly turning evil. And so while it's understandable, it's something that has to be dealt with. Whereas this particular character, the dwarf, kind of the outsider, if you will, is one of the few characters who remains resolute, albeit through kind of something that's outside of his control, because the concept of honor and debts and grudges are so ingrained into dwarven society. But nonetheless, because of that, he's one of the few people who is able to be relied on, by the dwindling cast of characters who are morally on the side of good. And so now, as far as evil goes, I think we've already covered that in terms of, with the Skaven, but amongst humanity, okay, the ruler of the empire at this point in time is a creep by the name of Boris Goldgather. And I have read a lot of stories, I've read a lot of books, seen a lot of movies, a lot of shows, but this guy is one of the cruelest evil tyrants I have ever, come across in, the stories I've read or the, shows I've watched. And he would give Joffrey from Game of Thrones a run for his money. And this guy, Boris, is a full-grown man. But he is just, man, at first you're thinking, he's, your typical, politicking and backstabbing out of necessity, type of guy, considering the setting he's in. But then you find out that, while some of that might be necessary in the setting, this guy goes way beyond it. And it gets to a point where, there's a point where things happen and to where, he decides to, leave his kingdom for the Skaven to have, so that way he and his chosen few can settle elsewhere, and they'll have their own private kingdom, so to speak, and hell with the civilians, and which is when the forces for good have to make the decision, do we risk everything and try and save the civilians of the besieged empire, or do we just let the Skaven wear themselves out and then try to attack, that kind of thing. But anyway, though, Boris at this point, when he forms his own little kingdom, it's like, I think that C.L. Warner might have been using The Mask of the Red Death. I think it's the Edgar Allan Poe story, where there was a plague throughout the kingdom, and so this ruler basically closes off his castle to everyone on the outside, and the only people that are safe are himself and those that he chooses to be within the castle. And at one point they decide, hey, let's have a party, and it's a wild party. But then it turns out one of the guests happens to be Death, and sure enough, everyone dies. Well, something like that happens within Boris Goldgather's new kingdom, and it's so it's one of those deals where it's horrifying, but at the same time you're rooting for him to get his comeuppance, though. And just to show you just how bad of a guy he is, there are many things that he does that make you root for his death or his comeuppance or what have you. But at one point, though, when he's in his little when he's on his new castle and what have you, there are beggars who are coming to the castle, hungry for food because every place else, all the food is gone, or it's rotted by the Black Plague and what have you. And so what Boris will do is he'll have these peasants come up to the castle, and he'll throw them just puny scraps of meat, and that'll be their meal. And he'll insist that they put on a little show, maybe a little dance or something like that. And it's just very degrading, very sadistic. And so that's not even the worst thing that he does, but that just gives you an idea. But nonetheless, though, he's a character who is human but indisputably evil. And there's one instance where you think there's a slight chance he might be turning over a new leaf, albeit out of desperation, but once that happened, once that moment passes, though, he goes back to his old self, and at that point, both the woman who is with him, as well as the reader, going through the story of this part. I mean, they already knew that there was no redemption for this guy, but when he's having this moment where he's basically praying to Sigmar, or all whatever god he can, mainly Sigmar, at this point, he's groveling, he's begging, he's sobbing, and all this, and you get the idea that, I mean, yes, it's out of desperation and a sense of self-preservation, but it's probably one of the few, I guess, relatably human moments that this character has. But then once things happen to where he realizes that, hey, I'm still alive, and he makes it clear he's going back to his old self, forget it, pal. But and there was another character by the name of Kreseg, who was human and within the camp of evil. And the interesting thing about him was that you have a little mini journey with this character, because he goes from, say, an upjumped commoner who made his way into the ranks of, I guess you could say, the military, but then he went on to become, I guess, the protector of the realm, because he knew he made it his point to know what was going on amongst the city, amongst the people, amongst the royalty, and he also even had an alliance with some of the Skaven. And he comes to find out, though, that any alliance with the Skaven, though, is mostly one-sided, and any benefits that humanity has with them would be short-lived. And so he kind of flip-flops back and forth. Like, I mean, he remains evil through and through, but there are times, though, where he's put in a position wherein he has to fight alongside certain forces on the side of good, but it's more of the enemy of my enemy is not my friend, but we're fighting together out of necessity, because this thing that we're both fighting will wipe everything out, that kind of thing. But nonetheless, though, I mean, it's like both sides, and both whoever he's working with, as well as himself, they're both sort of like, okay, yes, at certain point, we are fighting the Skaven, but we're definitely going to settle up after this, and there's that vibe. And so, he was definitely an interesting character. And I've used the comparison to Scarface before, and with him, I feel like it's kind of apt in some ways, except you're not necessarily rooting for this guy, but at the same time, you do find him compelling, or at least I found him compelling. And he was more compelling than, say, Boris Goldgatherer was. Because Boris, Goldgatherer, I mean, he was straight up evil and nothing redeemable about him. Whereas Kreseg, I mean, straight up evil as well. But he was someone who, at times, I could argue was lawful evil, because in some ways, not lawful evil, pragmatic evil. That's the term, pragmatic evil. Basically, he knew when to say keep on fighting, and he knew when to cut his losses, so to speak. So he was evil, but he wasn't stupid. Or if he got himself into a situation, say that ended up being more than he can handle, he did his damnedest to find a way out of it, even if it was through underhanded means. And so, and from that standpoint, he was compelling to read about, but nonetheless, you're wanting him to get his comeuppance, because some of the stuff he pulls, especially some of the characters on the side of good that he screws over, man. So, I mean, yeah, C.L. Warner does a really good job of reinforcing the notion that, for the most part, it's evil versus evil, albeit with the forces of good caught between. But nonetheless, he makes it, very clear, who we're, supposed to be rooting for, and we actually do end up rooting for the forces of good. And, even though it's more than a bit of a dwindling party in that respect, because this being the Warhammer Fantasy setting, good people, tend to not last as long, more often than not, as, say, those who are evil, unfortunately. But yeah, no, I really enjoyed this omnibus. I thought it was a very good collection, and I thought it really made you appreciate just how horrific of a threat the Skaven, were to the Warhammer world. And I totally forgot. I'm so sorry. I totally forgot. But there was another character who was of importance. A character by the name of Vanhall, who was originally, I believe he was a doctor, but because of a series of tragic losses amongst his family and loved ones, he ends up pursuing darker paths to beat death, namely necromancy, and he ends up becoming a top tier necromancer who becomes a threat that is on par with the Skaven. And his arc is more than a little tragic, because you see a character who was legitimately a good person, but he was just driven by grief as well as anger at those who profess to say have the power to cure his loved ones, but then it turns out it was all just a sham. But nonetheless, they were the ones who were endorsed by those in power. Whereas, say, other means of medical treatment were regarded as heresy, even if it was just something that was different from what was accepted. And so he just he's like, screw this. And once his family is gone, he just goes on a war path. He devotes all his time into becoming a necromancer, and sure enough, he eventually commands legions of the dead. We're talking legions. And when you've got say a force that is literally on par with the Skaven, that things are bad. So you got the Skaven, you've got basic human evil, and then you've got a necromancer who is wanting to bring the peace of the grave to the whole entire world. And there are some really, really cool moments with this guy, because you see just how powerful he's becoming. And along the way, considering that it's one of those deals where, on one hand, it's terrifying reading about him and his exploits, because a lot of the people that his armies kill are just innocent civilians. But on the other hand, though, more than a few happen to be people who are in need of some form of comeuppance. And so whenever someone who is a less than savory individual ends up meeting their fate at the hands of, say, one of his undead Vanhall's undead minions, or Vanhall himself, you're kind of like, yes. But then, all right, when you're talking Vanhall and his undead army against the Skaven, that's when you're like, okay, as grimdark as this is, we're bringing on the popcorn. Because at one point, more than one undead dragon is brought into the play. We're talking, Vanhall literally summons long dead dragons, and their bodies are just bursting forth from where their resting places were throughout the world, and coming to aid him and his army. And it's just like, you're reading about this and you're just like, oh my god. It's like I'm wondering if the people who did Game of Thrones, whenever the White Walkers were battling Daenerys' dragons, I wonder if the people who worked on that show may have read this particular trilogy, and when that part came up, they're like, dude, we need to do something like that. I mean, it's that awesome. I mean, it's horrifying, but it's awesome because I mean, it's literally undead dragons, being controlled by a necromancer, going up against, an unending horde of evil rat men with, their own technology, their own power, and what have you. But yeah, so I can't believe I initially forgot to mention him. But yeah, he's definitely one of the, like in a twisted way, in some ways, I was kind of pulling for his character in certain parts of the story. I was, but at the same time, I wasn't wanting him to succeed in his end-all, be-all goal of wiping out all of humanity and bringing them back as undead slaves. But I was, if anyone though, I was primarily rooting for Mandrid, for his character though, because he's, like I said, one of the few indisputably, morally upright characters, throughout the series of books that, stays true, to his goal of protecting his subjects, both, commoner and royal nobles. But yeah, there's so many characters in here that, I mean, while I said earlier, it can be initially difficult to keep track of who's who. They also, once you've figured out who's who, you get a lot of compelling, characters with their own stories, both on the side of good and evil, or somewhere in between. And I just really enjoyed this omnibus, and I thought it was a really good read, and at times a horrifying read, considering what the Skaven were capable of. But yeah, I'm going to go ahead and give the Black Plague 5 out of 5 stars. It was excellent, and it's definitely, if you're wanting to get into the Warhammer fantasy setting and you're wanting to see just how dangerous this world can be, I would say the Black Plague is a good place to start. But just, if you've got a weak stomach, though, you might want to pass on it, though, because it sometimes gets into the nitty-gritty as to, what kind of experiments the Skaven get up to, as well as the fact that these are literally human-sized, rat people, in all their grotesque glory. But anyway, though, yeah, thank you for taking the time to check out my review, and I hope y'all enjoyed it. And if y'all got any questions, comments, drop a line, let me know, and please like and subscribe if you did in fact, like this video. Y'all take care. Bye.